conversation. First of all, what a unique biblical name. It's not a very common in Israel, the name Amotz, who was the father of the prophet Yeshaya, Isaiah. So there you go. I know you didn't
So
choose
my
it,
last
though.
name is very biblical and rare.
Indeed, AsahEl. You didn't choose either, so I wouldn't credit
No,
you
they
with
didn't
it.
consult me.
Right, right. And in 1984, the Jewish American historian Barbara Tuchman wrote her book, The March of Folly, uh, which describes historical events which she deemed as folly by her definition, plagiarizing on your 2019 book, The Jewish March of Folly, obviously. And you have divided your book into 5 sections, each of them fascinating. But I suspect to some extent that the name of the book, The Jewish March of Folly, derives mainly from the first 2 parts of the book, dealing with solidarity and with political power. And I would very much like you to speak more about the thesis that you're presenting in these 2 first part of the book, which again, I might be in the wrong here, but were, if I read it correctly, the main reason for the title of the book.
Well, first of all, as I make plain in the book's introduction, Barbara Tuchman was indeed my inspiration. And my basic argument following what I read with her book, which basically accuses world leaders in all kinds of big historic events like Britain's loss of the American colonies or America's deterioration into the Vietnam War. She accuses leaders of having made fatal mistakes that created big historical dramas and traumas. And I say that the same thing happened with Jewish history, except it happened, unlike in those situations, it happened over millennia and involved thousands of leaders who, it was as if they passed a baton of a relay run from generation to generation, beginning with Moses and culminating in European Jewish leaders on the eve of the Holocaust. As for the 2 chapters that you cite, rightly, because our audience, I understand, is biblically oriented, and those 2 chapters are very biblically focused. I argue this, that the loss of the 10 tribes, first of all, is a forgotten Holocaust. In other words, I argue that its gravity and its impact were comparable with the Holocaust, despite the fact that, unlike the Holocaust, the Assyrians who caused the loss of the 10 Israel, they did not have a race theory. In all these respects, there is no analogy, but there is one analogy, and it is in the demographics, because in our time's Holocaust, in other words, in last century's Holocaust, the Jewish people lost 1/3 of its nation. In the Israelite Holocaust, when the 10 tribes vanished, more than half the Israelite nation vanished. That's why I call it the forgotten Holocaust. And I accuse the Israelite leaders in all the generations preceding it for having caused it. How? By emphasizing the tribe over the nation and the prophet over the statesman. In this, I go all the way back to Moses in his acquiescence with the request of the tribes of Gad and Reuben, who were then joined by half of Manasseh, but the request was only by the 2 of them, to settle beyond the borders that he mapped as the promised land. And they requested to settle to the east of those borders. And once he understood that this request is not the result of a quest to dodge the draft, in other words, to refrain from fighting with their brethren west of the Jordan, once he understood that this is not about draft evasion, he backed them. And in doing so, he unwittingly made the tribe an active political player in Israelite history. And this tribalism, I argue, ultimately brought down ancient Israel.
Mm-hmm. You put a great emphasis on the concept of anarchy and anarchism in the development of the political culture of Israel. how did anarchy led to those events that you described as the destruction of the first as well as the second temple, as well as more recent events?
Right. Well, first of all, complementing what I show that Moses did when he allowed the tribe to become an active historical player was Samuel's legacy. Samuel the prophet, when the tribes of Israel came to him and demanded do you hear me? When Samuel
I
the
hear you,
prophet
no
came
problem.
and in response to the tribe's request that he crown a king, obviously because there was a great deal of military pressure on them that they could only face as a collective. He refused to sanction that, and instead of that, he presented a whole ideology against any kind of government. That was already more than what Moses prescribed, because Moses, he did not go as far as saying government itself was bad, no matter what the circumstances. He said you should have government, but the government should be weak. This is why in Deuteronomy he says that if you should want to crown a king or once you're in your own land, you can do that, provided that this king be constricted in the number of women he can have, in the amount of gold he can have, and in the amount of horses that he can accumulate. And by doing that, he detected the three great temptations that to this day bring down political careers, namely sex, greed, and war. So Moses, he understood the risks of unchecked government, but he stopped short of saying that government of any sort is negative and therefore people should, the solution is anarchy. Samuel went a step forward and he condoned complete anarchism, as did Gideon. When the people requested of him, they told him what any politician wants to hear more than anything else: come be our king, you, your son, and your generations after. And he said, instead of saying, sure, great, instead of that, he said, no, I won't be your king. My son will not be your king. God will be your king. This, while noble, is anarchic. And I show that there were 12 forgotten civil wars among our forebears, 9 of them in the Bible, in other words, within biblical Israel, mostly, but not only, between Israel and Judah. And then there were 3 more civil wars within Greek and Roman era Judea, culminating ultimately in the most tragic of them all, the civil war that took place within the walls of Jerusalem while the Romans were laying siege to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Alongside along the same lines of what you've just said, some have even suggested that these verses describing the king and the limitations, the do's and don'ts of a Jewish king, should be read as a subversive text. In a sense, it says make a king, have a king, but really it says don't have a king. And you're limiting it to saying, no, it says have a king, but be that king checked in all of these aspects of women, gold, and horses, which would be the equivalent of don't have a foreign ministry, because marrying a lot of women, basically foreign relations in the most literal sense of it, right? You don't marry 1,000 women because you have such a big appetite. You marry 1,000 women because you want to have foreign relations with those foreign entities. You don't have money because just you can eat breakfast 3 times. You have money because you want to run the economy, and you don't have horses and chariots because you like the hippodrome to be filled with action all the time, but rather in order to have a big army, while you suggest that it is like not the full way of a subversive text, but just checking kingship in Israel. 2 ways of looking at that law. Another very interesting thesis that you bring forth in the 3rd part of your book, which talks about the location or the place of the Jewish people, really points to the beginning of the Jewish people as a Jewish people in the period of Jeremiah and Mordecai, both of them marking a change of scenery, a change of place, moving from Israel, from the biblical land of Israel, outwards, either to Egypt in the case of Jeremiah, or to Mesopotamia for Mordecai. And starting from the process of compartmentalization of Judaism, in the sense that you can pack your Judaism into your suitcase and move elsewhere, up to the notion of Franz Rosenzweig of idealization of, he wasn't the first, but he's well known for it, idealization of the Jewish existence in the diaspora. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. We here in Israel basically have been raised on the axiom, which is completely unfounded, that the Jews' dispersal was not a Jewish choice, but a Jewish fate. The choice was that of their conquerors who drove them away from their land. There is some truth to that, of course, because there have been two very traumatic conquests of the Promised Land, each of which indeed resulted in some exiling of the Jews and before them the Israelites. But having said this, I show in that chapter that the departure from the Jewish homeland to the big outer world was a Jewish choice, and more than anyone else, it's personified by the biography of Mordecai in the book of Esther, where it says plainly, never mind right now the historicity of the story, it's problematic in many ways. We're discussing here the literary statement over there, and literarily speaking, Mordecai is presented as someone who personally was among the exiles from Jerusalem, in fact, from before the destruction, from the exile of King Jehoiachin. And despite that, he lived through the days of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, who lived after Cyrus. In other words, Judah or Judea was already open for the Jews' return by the time of the story of the book of Esther, but he, instead of veering back west from today's Iraq, back to Jerusalem where he had been driven from, he goes east, all the way to today's Iran. This is the willing and the voluntary expansion of the Jewish universe, what I call the Jewish universe. And the same goes, if his is the initiation of this geography, then Ezra is the toleration of this geography. He, as the leader of the Jews who did return to Jerusalem and as the great restorer of the temple and the rituals in Jerusalem, there is no indication or no documentation or a hint even that he called on the Jewish diaspora to return home. Instead, he fashioned Jerusalem as the spiritual reactor of the Jewish nation. And so Jerusalem and Judea suddenly became something entirely different. Before that, they were the great center of gravity for a landed nation. Now they became a spiritual reactor for a global nation. This is how I show that it was all voluntary, and I later, of course, argue that it was also destructive.
Mm-hmm. The fourth part of your book, which dovetails closely with the third one, talks about the changes in time, and you describe the publication of the Jewish calendar, the not the lunisolar Jewish calendar in the mathematical way it is today, without having to convene the Sanhedrin or any other legal body to decide these matters of a leap month or a leap year. You describe that as surrendering of the authority concerning the Jewish time, be that by Hillel II in the mid-4th century, or maybe even later, according to some scholars. Why do you see this point as a surrendering of the time as far as the Jewish universe?
I split what I call Jewish time into two dimensions. One is the cyclical time that you're discussing, the one that's governed through the calendar, and the other is the historic time, which is linear and looks
linear
back
in the
to
sense of teleological, or linear in what sense?
Chronologically. In other words, it has a beginning, a middle, and a future.
Yeah.
As opposed to the cyclical that is governed by the seasons of the year, and the moon's orbit around Earth and Earth's around the sun. And this is cyclical time, and this is what was governed through the calendar. The point about the calendar that you're asking is this, that it used, according to Jewish sources, namely the Mishnah, we understand that the method was for a special court to convene in Jerusalem, and based on ordinary people's testimonies that they detected the beginning of the new moon, and after some questioning that verified what they saw, they then ruled that the new moon arrived, and then they conveyed this message abroad through a system of mountaintop bonfires that went all the way from Judea through the Jordan Valley, through Syria, to Iraq, which was the big demographic center of the Jewish people in those centuries. This system was discontinued by the rabbis of the Galilee sometime in the 5th century because of anti-Jewish pressure at the time by the Romans and the Byzantines that were on their way. And instead of that, they created simply a document. In other words, a well-calculated long-term calendar that determined the Jewish new months for many years to come. And in principle, this is the way it's done to this day. I argue that in doing this, they severed the last practical tie between the ordinary Jew anywhere in the Jewish universe. In other words, the Jew in Rome and in Persia and in Egypt those days would every 30 days look to see what was ruled in Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem that would govern his own life, to tell him when the next Shabbat, when the next Jewish holiday is, and everything that stems from it. With the annulment of that mechanism, that last presence of the Jewish homeland in a diaspora Jew's life vanished.
And hence dovetailing closely with the notion of changing the location of the people. The last part of your book, which might not be as long as the previous, parts, but is certainly fascinating, and some might even find it the most fascinating, is talking about the Jewish psyche, so to speak. And it talks about the Jewish psyche in three main aspects. You claim, okay, I will focus on maybe two of them. The sociologists, some sociologists as well as genetic researchers have talked about the Jewish genius question in terms that talk about almost a full standard deviation from the general population, talking about researches that have been done with Ashkenazi Jews in the US, deviating almost a full standard deviation above the norm. You are suggesting one main reason for that. Would you care to elaborate how this reason develops from the Second Temple period and onwards up until the modern era with the Enlightenment, and bringing us to this day where the percentage of Jewish Nobel Prizes is obviously skyrocketing in comparison to their part of the population?
Well, there clearly is a phenomenon, a statistical phenomenon of Jewish excellence that has boggled many minds. For instance, as you cite here, the disproportionate number of Jews among Nobel laureates. So first of all, I would say about this that I know many stupid Jews, and I think that you do too. And some of them are very stupid. And I don't think there is anything inherent or biological about us Jews that makes us smarter. I have to demystify this notion for both the people who make too much of the Jews, and also for the people who use this as a cause to hate the Jews. It's not the case. There is, however, a phenomenon of Jewish excellence, no doubt. And I make plain that it is the result of not of biology, but of culture, and specifically of the Jewish introduction, which is well documented. The Jewish introduction already in antiquity, before the times of Jesus, the Jewish introduction of compulsory education. This is light years before any other civilization. If I'm not mistaken, the next civilization that is documented to have done anything of the sort was the Aztecs in the 16th century, shortly, by the way, before they were annihilated by the Spaniards, but that's besides the point. In Western
By the
civilization,
viruses, they're actually
exactly.
in you know,
In
like
Western, they had no quarantining, yeah.
right.
In Western civilization, compulsory education only followed, and a long time afterwards, both the invention of the printing press and then the Industrial Revolution. The Jews were educating their boys and their girls since antiquity to read and write. Moreover, nothing was more valuable in Jewish society than scholastic excellence. In other words, after every child was taught to read and write, um, they proceeded to studying the law of all disciplines. And there was no investment in Jewish culture as there was in Greek and Roman cultures, or at least in their elites, of teaching children to write expositorily or to be great orators or scientists. This was not the focus. The focus was the law. And from a very young age, children were taught the law, and those of them who displayed skills for ingenious for developing in this were cultivated, and then they were admired, and then they were celebrated. They were the celebrities of Jewish society wherever the Jews went and no matter when they lived. And the result was that the Jewish rich man, anywhere, for them, the ideal son-in-law that would marry their daughter was not the fellow rich man's son, but the local Talmudic seminary's humbly born prodigy. And this
Kind
is
of
why,
a social selection for or natural social selection for excellence in studies, while some have remarked that if you were a Christian and you were a great scholar, you were a priest and you didn't have kids.
that's
So
true. That's
right,
true. And in the Muslim world, things were worse because when the printing press was invented, all centers of Muslim authority, in other words, the Turkish, the Arabic, and the Persian centers, all of them banned the usage of the printing press because they saw in it, by the way, rightly, they saw in it a threat to religious authority. There was wisdom in that. It was as if they foresaw what Martin Luther would do with the
right.
printing press to Catholicism. So they prevented that, but at the same time, they imposed backwardness on their civilization. None of this happened with the Jews. The Jews, whenever an invention came along that could help teaching and studying, they embraced it. So
Like
to
we
get back
embrace
to what,
Zoom, right?
yes, that's right. So to get back to what I was saying before, because of this culture, because of this legacy, the Jews continuously had brains marry money. And because there was such cultivation of scholastic excellence, once the Jews broke beyond the walls of the ghetto under the circumstances that followed the French Revolution, and they joined the general society, they were equipped and armed with a legacy of intensive studying, and they simply shifted the focus from studying the Talmud and all the legalese that it required to studying other disciplines and excelling in them.
Hmm. Last question about the book, and then maybe we can shift to your to seeing the future in a sense. You talk about Jews as revolutionaries. Um, Even in a broader sense, I think that practically everything that ends with an ism has a very, very strong representation of Jews, um, be that communism or capitalism. You know, it depends. In the U.S., some of them were accused as communists, in Soviet Russia as capitalists, and in Nazi Germany as both. So, um, why do you think, does that have to do with a very individualistic nature of thinking among Jews that leads them to be the forefront of every possible ism?
Well, it certainly was the situation between the 19th and the 20th centuries. That's documented, and there's no, as I demonstrate over there, the presence of Jews among the leaders of those social revolutions was obviously disproportionate. And the reason is that, in my view, they were paradoxically um, heirs to the prophetic legacy that demanded social justice, albeit in strange ways, as they did in the 19th and 20th centuries. We're now wise in retrospect to understand how failed and naive and cruel those revolutions ended up being, but this is part of the explanation. The other is that they were as Jews in 19th century Europe and in the early 20th century Europe, and then also in the United States, they were socially challenged, forbidden from climbing as high up as they thought they could. And when you feel that society mistreats you, you might become a revolutionary. That happens all the time. Today, if I'm not mistaken, this is no longer the case. If you look at the big revolutionary energies in today's world, they're in other realms, and the Jews are not prominent. First of all, in my view, the biggest revolutionary energy in today's world is Islamism, certainly the most potent. And that obviously doesn't include one Jew. It has the occasional Jewish cheerleader, but that's even not anecdotal. That's why I say, once again, to proceed from these phenomena to conclusions about Jewish nature is absurd.
Okay. Some have, your book has made a lot of ripples in the Israeli water, and politicians center right and center left, I would say, have dwelt into the book to show how they are right all along, obviously. Do you think that we are already out of this March of Folly, or are we continuing? And if we're continuing, in what ways are we continuing this March of Folly? What would be the blind side, the blind spots of Israeli policymaking today, in your opinion?
Well, I'll begin with the happy side and then proceed to the less happy side. The happy side is that for the first time since antiquity, we're but several years away from the moment in which most of the Jewish people resides in the Jewish homeland. The demographers with whom I speak over there claim that
Sergio de
this
la
will,
Pergola, I used to, he was my professor at the Hebrew University, so
so you know
yeah,
him well, and
yeah.
he's a serious, very professional statistician. And he says that by his counts, the moment in which there are more Jews in Israel than there are together in the rest of the world is from here 7 or so years away. And in other words, it's tomorrow, historically speaking, maybe even tonight. And this um, will be a turning point in my view, in Jewish history, on the scale of the turning point in American history that the disappearance of the frontier was back at the end of the 19th century. That's the happy side. The unhappy side is in several places. First of all, in ultra-Orthodoxy, whose sanctification of the community and the sect and the ghetto are exactly, in my view, what caused the ancient Israelite wars. They have not at all searched their souls and tried to draw conclusions from Jewish history, or indeed from the ancient Jewish leaders' March of Folly, as Zionism did. Zionism did draw these conclusions. I see this also in a certain currents within Messianic Judaism, who, while being in deep dispute with ultra-Orthodoxy, nevertheless do remind me of our forebears' March of Folly in their willingness to shed all rational analysis of the power play within of the geopolitical power play to which the Jews must correspond, and instead of that, try to have a very simplistic reading of the scriptures dictate foreign policy. And I see that also, that kind of eagerness for schism among us Israelis within parts of the Messianic Israelis' adversaries. And I talked with some of them at the book's end, as you may recall. And judging by what we saw, the dynamics that we saw over the past year, in which Israel underwent its worst political crisis since its creation, I feared that this penchant of our forebears to not reconcile with each other and to stubbornly march towards a civil strife was once again at play. That is why I in my column, backed Benny Gantz's coalition with Netanyahu, which among lefties like myself is not a popular stance in the media. Among the public, I think polls indicate that most of blue and white's voters actually backed him in this move, but never mind that. I was fearing that we're once again heading towards that kind of schism and that kind of dynamic of civil war. And I think we've averted it, but it's far from over, the whole saga. And that also goes very, very ominously for Netanyahu's ongoing assault on the judiciary, which reminds me of what I mentioned
We
in
have
the
an
book.
expert on matters of judiciary coming Thursday, Gil
Okay.
Bringer. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I cite in the book, albeit in a different context, I cite there the great showdown between the Jewish Supreme Court in
Shimon ben Shattach and
ancient
Alexander
Jerusalem,
Gineas,
headed by
right.
Shimon ben Shattach, or Simon, and in which he confronted the king of the day, Alexander Yanai, the Hasmonean. And I find similarities between Alexander's attitude and Netanyahu's attitude. In other words, tries to overpower the judiciary rather than to respect and salute it. And this is, while he is unlike Netanyahu, he's not a suspect or he's not a defendant, he's only a witness about what his servant or what his slave did. That remains, this fear of mine, sadly, remains relevant.
Okay. Thank you for your time. I think that we could have had this conversation going forward much longer, but your time is precious. And again, thank you for allowing us to hear you and hear about your book. The most important question is, when will your book be available in English?
I'm working on a proposal, and you have to stay tuned.
Okay, we will stay tuned, and as soon as it is available in English, I will send obviously a link to Amazon or whatever way to get it to all my students. And thank you very much, Amos.
Thank you, Neti.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So guys, a little bit of